Okay, so guys, monitoring and record keeping is very important. It's a very important part of our processes. We can think of our processes as a three-legged stool. If you remove one, the stool's not going to stand. So if you removed cleaning, the stool falls over. Same with sterilization, and same with monitoring and record keeping. These are the three foundational things of what we do. Think of it this way. There's an old nurse's adage. I don't know if you know any old nurses, but you might hear them say, if it's not documented or written down, then it never happened. So this is true. It doesn't matter how many hours you spent doing it. If you didn't keep records, then it's like it never happened. We can't consider things to be sterile if we didn't keep a record of the sterilization. So records provide evidence that processes were routinely checked, and then the information collected provides a quality framework that will be examined by surveying agencies like the Joint Commission, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and even these records could be subpoenaed in a court case. If the hospital were being sued for an infection, we would have to go and prove that we're doing right by the patients. In our defense, it's not that this is the only reason to keep records, but it is a very good reason to keep records. Another reason to keep records is because we can then look back at records and say, use the information in records to improve our processes, because in the end, it really is about having the best quality for the patients. So record keeping is mandatory. We have to keep records of certain things, certain processes like sterilization. We should keep records of decontamination processes, how the machines are functioning, etc. Okay, records must be accurate. So let's say you wrote down something on a document that you were going to sterilize tray X, and then for whatever reason tray X had to come off the sterilizer. You would have to put a line through that and initial that you removed it. It's no longer part of that record. It's important that you don't scribble out something. Although I already know that human nature means we're going to start scribbling and then we'll be like, oops, all right. Records must be legible. If I can't read your writing, then how am I going to know what you wrote? This is literally true. I have, even with students, I have brought a student or an experienced working tech over to a record document and said, what did you write here? And the answer is, I don't know. If you can't read your own writing, then how's anybody else supposed to read it? Okay, records must be complete. So that tray X that we removed, we replaced tray X with tray Y, and that must also be documented on that record. Cross all your T's and dot all your I's, and don't forget that little squiggly line on your Q. Records must be audited routinely. This is an internal audit, and this may be an official auditing process, whereas a lead tech once a week goes through all the records and verifies that the information is complete, accurate, and legible. Or it could be you coming in to take over, let's say, on sterilization, and so you just do a quick check of some of the records from earlier in the day. That's an audit. Okay, the definition of monitor, you can read that on your own. General monitoring. Some monitoring is actually formal and some is informal. So informal monitoring could be just making sure that everyone who comes into your department is actually wearing the appropriate attire, like a hat. I once had to go and ask a doctor if he was looking for something in particular and show him the exit because he came down the wrong elevator carrying a cup of coffee and not wearing a hair covering. So that is monitoring, informal monitoring. Other informal monitoring would be checking the drain screen in the autoclave, checking the gasket, checking the drain screen in the washer, making sure that there's no garbage in the bottom of it. Keeping your eyes open, knowing what's happening around you, And yes, sometimes you may even be faced with a doctor, ooh, scary doctor, who is actually violating the dress code of your department. No need to scream at her, just help her find the exit. Okay, so we're expected to monitor our areas this way. There's also formal monitoring. So just rule of thumb, formal monitoring would be things that need to be documented. So temperature and humidity levels of the department's various areas need to be measured and then documented. That would be formal monitoring. There's many words in these paragraphs about formal monitoring of the department. Other things that may be formal or informal, honestly, just looking at a preventative maintenance sticker is a informal monitoring, but then taking that piece of equipment and setting it aside and putting it on a list of items that need to go and get preventative maintenance, that would be formal because you're documenting it. Does that make sense? Formal versus informal? Okay. So decontamination area monitoring, obviously you're going to make sure that spills get cleaned up, things like that. Things on the floor need to be picked up. You're monitoring, but you don't have to document that you mopped up a spill. Then of course there's water quality. Water quality should be checked routinely to make sure that the water pH level and the mineral content of the water are kept in the right range. This should be done routinely according to your department's policy, and then documented. Because, like I said earlier, the Joint Commission or CMS may come in and want to see evidence that what you're doing in your department is actually going to be able to provide the properly clean and sterilized instruments for patients. There are commercially prepared water testing products that can be purchased to test water on a weekly or daily basis. See, the book doesn't really say how often. So that's going to be up to the department, but it is something that should be done. Monitoring of mechanical cleaning equipment. In our decontamination area, we have two main things that are mechanical cleaning equipment: ultrasonic cleaners and washers. And then of course the cart washer is also a washer. The ultrasonic cleaners work by a process called cavitation, right? We learned that from SPT 140. So how do we know that they're actually cavitating? In the monitoring lesson in quizzes that I created and assigned to you, it actually will show up one of the slides that shows a picture of an unprocessed and then a good result on that cavitation test. That is one version of the test. As long as it's being done, probably should be done every day. However, I think the machine's instructions for use might tell you how often to do it. And then the test, whoever made the test, that brand, that company will tell you how to use their test. And then document it. Why go through all those steps of testing if we're not going to document it? Because in the end, if we don't have any record that we ran the tests, that's going to be bad for us in the event that perhaps there was a lawsuit in which we had to prove that we were doing everything correct. Washer disinfectors, of course, visually check every day. Make sure that the spray arms are able to rotate and are not clogged. If debris is left in the bottom of the washer on that screen, every time cycles run, it can just, it's a lot, sometimes it's paper. Okay, so the paper, the cards that go into the containers, if we don't remove them from the containers or any other debris that goes in there, it'll just disintegrate. Then it'll make its way in into the spray arm, and it'll start blocking the spray ports. So if you have blocked spray ports, this is not going to be good. The machine's not going to function the way it was designed. So let me tell you a story, okay? Once upon a time, I worked in a department where there was one of the spray arms that fell out of the machine, and I would have put it back in and called for service for somebody to actually put it in and make it permanent, because we needed the washer. But I didn't have all the parts, so I put the machine out of service. Went home for the weekend, came back Monday, and they were using the machine without the spray arm. Do you think that machine was functioning properly? No. And yet someone took it upon themselves to remove that do not use sign and use the washer anyways, just because they felt like we need this washer. Okay. The machines, as well, at least the washer disinfectors and the cart washers, actually have a physical monitor, which is going to be the printout. The printout tells us, it's the machine telling us what it was doing for all those minutes that it was functioning, that it was filling, that it was circulating enzymes or whatever. And so we keep those records in an envelope to make sure that in the event those records are needed ever to show that we are doing right and that the machines are functioning, then we will have them. Informal monitoring of a washer, of course, I mentioned making sure the drain screens are clean, making sure the arms rotate. Cart washers, they're just really big washers, so it's the same deal, making sure that everything moves and that there's no garbage in the bottom of the machine. High-level disinfection processes need to be monitored. Okay. And I'll tell you where we're going to leave here. We're going to leave off on page 362. But the high-level disinfection process must be monitored. It is similar to sterilization in that respect. All of the sterilization processes must be monitored. The monitors for high-level disinfection may include a printout that the machine is telling you that it's doing right, or if you're not using a machine, then you have to make sure that you are still doing everything else, like testing the efficacy of the strips that are used to test the efficacy of the high-level disinfectant. So not only do you have to test the high-level disinfectant, but you also have to test the strips that you're used to testing the high-level disinfectant. Everything's got to be documented. So in some ways, this is way more detailed than simply sterilizing something in an autoclave. You have to write down things like the date the test strips are opened, because once those test strips in that bottle are opened, there's a clock countdown. It's probably going to be 30 days, and then the manufacturer would say, you have to discard these and open a new bottle. Doing manual disinfecting, you should document the date, the result of the test strips, which would be the minimum effective concentration, MEC, the expiration date of the test strips, and the expiration date of the disinfecting solution, what was disinfected, the name of the tech who disinfected it, and the name of the patient on whom the item was used. Okay. In an automated endoscope reprocessor, there's usually a printout. We would follow the manufacturer's IFU to ensure the proper testing of the disinfecting solution takes place. So that could be the manufacturer of the machine. If you're using something like parasitic acid, there's this one machine called a Medivator. Well, that's what we call it, the Medivator. You take a sample of the disinfecting solution after the cycle has run. A little bit of it is stored in a little accessible place for the tech to grab it, put a test strip in there and say, good, it's a pass. Other AERs, you might be using glutaraldehyde, in which case that solution is the same solution for several scopes or several devices that you're sterilizing or high-level disinfecting. And you need to check it before you expose the items to that high-level disinfectant. Are there any questions thus far? I'm getting a no. All right. Okay. So the next one we're going to talk about monitoring in the sterilization area. Now, we had left off on page 362 and the topic of monitoring in the sterilization area. There are things to do in the sterilization area besides sterilize. Monitor, of course. The sterilization process requires a monitoring system to help ensure that sterilization parameters are being met. Okay, so this is not news to you. This you understand. If we can't show some evidence that sterilization took place, then we cannot really say that we have sterilization. It's just a fact. So we have process indicators, chemical indicators that are designed to respond with a chemical or physical change to one or more of the physical conditions within the sterilization chamber. We also have biological and physical. Now, the chemical indicators that you're most likely going to be using, the vast majority will be the type 5 indicators. And that is internal, is what I mean to say. And there's a picture of some internal type 5 indicators and otherwise on page 363. The top one and the middle one are type 5s. The others are type 1, and they're meant for other processes other than steam. But the two basic types of indicators are internal and external. So you already know that our tape and our locks that we put on the ends of trays, these are not only tamper-evident seals, of course, but they also have an indicator on them, which helps us to separate what has been through a process and what has not been through a process. We cannot consider these to be 100% foolproof. I think I told you about the time somebody put a load into an autoclave, shut the door, never pushed the go button, and the heat from the autoclave over the course of hours was enough to change these external indicators to indicate that they've been through a process. So they are not foolproof, and they are not evidence that something was sterilized. They're to keep something, to keep a separation. Okay. Although some people may say, this provides visual evidence that the package was exposed to a sterilant. I don't want you to think that way, because I know of the tragedies that can happen when people are not really focused on working the process accurately. Robert, did you leave? Okay, that's fine. We'll catch you on the other side. Okay, chemical indicators for the inside of the packs. Internal indicators. Do they provide proof of sterility? Absolutely not, because you know what does? Nothing does. Nothing actually will provide proof of sterility. We're just collecting bits of evidence. So if you have the outside external indicator showing a change and the internal indicator showing a change, you have just added to the evidence. You should know that with the internal indicators, it's possible to have one or more failed inside of a tray or inside of a load, showing, of course, if there's a failed indicator inside of a tray, that means that that tray is not usable. It's also possible to have one single tray in a load have a failed indicator in it, which means that the rest of the load can be considered acceptable. However, you might be wondering, well, how am I going to know if the rest of the load is acceptable unless I open every tray and contaminate it? That is a fair question. I cannot answer that for you. Unless you can say with absolute certainty that you know the reason why the one in the one tray failed. Now, this might really work in like a recall situation where the OR tech opens up a tray and finds an unacceptable indicator in the tray. And then you start initiating a recall, but some of those trays have been used. Now, if the techs who used those trays did not find bad results on indicators inside those trays, we could probably say it's safe. Of course, the doctor would want to know that there is always that question of whether or not that tray was properly sterilized. So why might a CI result in a failure? It could be utility or sterilizer malfunction, inappropriate sterilizer loading techniques, not using the correct CI, choosing the wrong cycle, poor storage of the CI indicators, improper packing techniques, or not following the container's IFU, or not following the medical device manufacturer's IFU. The container's IFU. That's crazy. Yeah, okay, so if it says use one filter, use one filter. Don't use a stack of filters. You see, those filters will restrict the flow of air at Sterling. I've actually been in the decontamination room and disassembling rigid containers, and I found situations where people just put like a stack of 3 or 4 filters in there, and I cringe. Okay. So we had the chemical indicators, the chemical monitors. Now we got the physical monitors. So these include things like displays, printouts, gauges, pressure recorders. So these are things that you can see. They're basically the machine telling you what is happening at in the various phases. Like at 0:00 at 1300, I went into conditioning. Okay, and the temperature was this and the pressure was that. So these you need to retain as records of sterilization processes. We're not going to retain a snapshot of the display that might be on the autoclave, but there will also be a printout that comes with it. So more news, more good news. You may not have to actually have paper in that printer if the sterilizer is capable of interfacing with a tracking system and sharing the information with the tracking system. Of course, I'm a little bit iffy on that myself because I think I'd rather keep that paper copy as a backup and keep the whole paper printing system as a backup should something fail. Computers are not perfect. Okay, biological indicators. So these are the little ampules that contain Geobacillus or Bacillus atrophaeus, or, well, those are the two we use really. So biological indicators are one of the most important sterilizer monitors available to the CSTech. It doesn't say the most, it says one of the most. At the completion of the sterilization cycle, the BI should be incubated according to manufacturer's instructions. Okay, so you should actually know how the manufacturer of the biological indicator that's in that process challenge device wants you to deal with it. They have instructions like take the pack out, wait for so many minutes, open the pack, wait for so many minutes, take the ampule out, wait for so many minutes. They want to make sure that it's cool, because if you start messing with if you start working with that hot biological, it can actually harm you if that juice all spills out and it burns you. Okay, so you understand the control test, right? You have the test pack that goes into the autoclave, and then you have the control ampule. They both end up in the incubator. The control does not go through the sterilization process like the test does. The control is really just there to make sure that that test would have been capable of growing. Because the test, we want to make sure it's dead, but how do we know if it was even alive to begin with? That's the control. So it only makes sense that you would choose a control from the exact same lot number. If the lot number on the test you were running was 2020-09 ABC, then the control would have to match that. And then when we're talking about positive and negative results, we're talking about positive for growth or negative for growth. So negative for growth on a test is good, even though the word negative we usually associate with something not good. Positive, of course, then would be good for a control, but bad for a test. Does a negative BI prove that all the items in the load are sterile? Absolutely not. Nothing proves. It is another piece of evidence. But it isn't even evidence that everything in the load is sterile, because as noted earlier with the chemical indicators, there could be one fail on the load. And so we have the way we load sterilizers, we stick to a certain type of method, whereas we're putting hard, rigid containers on the bottom, peel pouches on the top, wrapped items anywhere but under a rigid container, and making sure that we don't overcrowd the sterilizer. If we overcrowd the sterilizer, we could end up with a sterilization failure in certain containers and still have a negative biological test. So these tests are in what we call a process challenge device, a PCD. PCDs are the standard. We will run one. Most places will run one in each load, and there's a good reason for that, and that is dealing with and potentials for recall. If you have a positive BI test, then you'll have to do a recall on that load and every other load since the last negative test result. Okay, every load that contains implants must also include a biological process challenge device. And every load sterilized with ethylene oxide also must include a biological process challenge device. There are some reasons why you might have positive BIs. Operator error is a big one. Could be using the wrong BI or the wrong PCD. You could be incorrectly placing the BI in the sterilizer. You could possibly be not following the manufacturer's instructions, poor storage conditions, incorrect cycle selection, or not loading the sterilizer cart in a way that allows air removal and sterilant penetration around and through the load. So it's a common thing with techs that they just want to get all of this stuff into this load. So this is how we end up overloading sterilizers. If I just move this here and set this on top of the process challenge device, I can get one more thing in there. So what's going to happen, the steam won't be able to get into the PCD and you'll end up with a positive BI. Process challenge devices on page 365. It shows a couple examples of PCDs. So these are for steam. The process challenge device for ethylene oxide looks a little bit different, and there was a picture of that one in chapter 15. Okay. Sterilizer printouts. They are what they are. They're a written record of the autoclave telling you what it has done. Pay attention to these. When that load is finished, for sure, before you go any further, verify that the parameters were met. I have found a sterilizer that was malfunctioning, and while normally a sterilizer that is not reaching temperature or pressure will alert you to it with an alarm, this sterilizer was not. And so there were 3 loads where the temperature wasn't reached and held for 4 minutes, and those loads were not sterilized then. Sterilization load control numbers. Here's an example right here of, it says date sterilized 12/18/25. Oh boy. So the load control numbers should be unique and should not recur. So the example of the one that we use in our department, in our lab, our department, it shows the The first digit is going to be the autoclave number, and then the next digit is the year, and then the next digits are the Julian date. This is common for hospitals to do it, but it's by no means the only way to do it. They may actually be putting the physical date, so and not the Julian date, but using the Gregorian calendar on their stickers, or they could be doing both. So it's very important that this load information is on everything that is in the autoclave, because believe it or not, it's not just about recalls, although it is largely about recalls. The operating room, the staff in the OR, they need the information on where this item was sterilized, what load, what day, what sterilizer number, to go into the patient's chart. Just imagine if a patient decided to sue over an infection they got because they let their dog lick their wound or something crazy like that, and then we're going to lose the case because we had no way to track the items used on that patient to any particular sterilization run that we could then show evidence that sterilization happened. Some information that should be recorded on the log sheet and maintained for each sterilization cycle is the load control number, specific items sterilized, like minor pan 1 belonging to the OR, towel packs times 10 belonging to CS, sternal saw belonging to CVOR. Most of the things that you sterilize will belong to the operating room, with the exceptions. We usually don't write out minor set belonging to the OR because that's kind of understood. But let's say the operating room has its own sternal saw and then CVOR has their sternal saws. We would definitely want to make sure that we're documenting which one it is. Now, with the advent of tracking systems where you can just scan a barcode, it's much easier to make sure that we have the correct and proper information. But there's no guarantee that you're going to go into a place that has that either. Exposure time and temperature should be documented. Sterilizer operator identification, ask you, and results of the biological testing if applicable. So I'm not accustomed to putting those on the load record, but in a separate book. But you know, I've worked in a few hospitals, and we didn't then duplicate the biological testing information on the load record because we already had it in a separate book. Responses of the CI, and then results of the Bowie-Dick test if it has been performed. Note on page 367 near the top, it says a recall is initiated for a positive BI or a non-responsible CI. Wet packs or other sterility problems. Knowing the contents of the load enables you to know where to go to reclaim the packages. This documentation can be compiled manually or in a sterilization logbook, or there are computer software programs available to compile and maintain these records. Now, again, if you have this positive BI or a non-responsive CI, you'll have to do a recall of that load. Validation and verification. A manufacturer, I want to put this in the simplest terms, okay? A manufacturer of an item, let's say they're selling this new sterilizable mouse, they have to jump through all the right hoops with the FDA to make before they can market it, because the FDA is concerned about public health, patient safety. So they have to prove to the FDA that they can make it safe for patients and that it's using methods that are commonly available in hospitals. So that process that they go through is called a validation. We in the hospital do not do our own validations. We will do a verification. A verification process looks like this. You'll take the item and you'll sterilize it the way the manufacturer says. Now, if it's a large complex tray, you're going to end up putting biologicals and chemical indicators in various difficult to sterilize areas inside of the tray. putting it through the process, opening it up, and planting the bugs in the incubator and reading the results of the CIs. I find it interesting because of all the times we've had new vendors bringing their sets into the hospitals, and we need to get them sterilized. We did not do verifications. As a matter of fact, we often did not even have the instructions for use, and we would just sterilize the trays as if they were other trays. Does that make sense to you? No, it doesn't. So if there were an issue, an infection, and infections do happen, and sometimes it is our fault. If there were an infection, we would have gotten slammed over actually not having done a verification or even going by the instructions for use. Sterilizer qualification testing. Qualification testing is performed to verify that the sterilizer is in actually good working condition in the location that's being used. So I've done that. We built a new department, we had a bunch of new sterilizers, and I did the qualification testing according to the instructions for use from the sterilizer manufacturer. Basically, it's like with a, let's say your autoclave went down, because you're probably not going to experience getting brand new autoclaves very often, but your autoclave went down, and it had to have a major repair done to it. A major repair would require a qualification testing, which consists of 3 consecutive biological process challenge device tests, and then 3 consecutive Bowie-Dick tests. And then you wait for the results. If all 3 come back good, then you're good to run that sterilizer. So this is, we're talking about major repairs. If they replace a door gasket, that's not a major repair. But something like replacing the door itself, that's going to be a major repair. How do you know which is which? Well, golly, you could ask the guy who did the work, or when in doubt, err on the side of caution and do the qualification testing. It's not going to hurt. There is sterilizer specific monitoring, like testing of dynamic air removal sterilizers. Note, the Bowie-Dick test is not for testing SFPP, although it is a dynamic air removal sterilizer cycle. It is not for, the Bowie-Dick is not for testing that. It is for testing pre-back sterilizer cycles. Okay, not in gravity displacement either. Okay, leak testing, there is a built-in leak test function that for years I did not know was there. We should be doing that leak test and documenting it at least once a week, or according to the instructions for use on your sterilizer, and documenting the results. And then if you should go into the bad zone, that sterilizer needs to be repaired. I asked a manager of one of the local hospitals, I said, how often do you do a leak test? And the answer was, if we start getting wet loads. So if you think about it, if you're getting wet loads, if you believe that you could be getting wet loads because you have a leaky sterilizer, then shouldn't you be doing a leak test routinely in hopes of avoiding the wet loads? I don't know how to explain how horrible wet loads are. Let's just say it's like somebody just came up and kicked you in the chest. And if you can't explain why you're getting wet loads, you're just going to keep getting kicked in the chest. And guess what, y'all? We're almost to the end. I'm just going to talk a little bit about continuing education. Continuing education. After you get out of this class and you get certified and you're in the field, you need to do continuing education. So some of these the assignments that I give you, where you go to like Key Surgical or Fiedler, these are continuing education type assignments. These are by no means the only place to get these, but the ones that I find they're examples of continuing education. And so you can just go and do them again after you're certified with a different email account. Okay? That's it. I'm going to stop recording now.